The morning it arrived, I thought it was a mistake. The letter sat on my kitchen table, heavy and deliberate, sealed with deep gold wax, the kind of wax that whispered of old money and older secrets. For a long while, I just stared at it. The envelope carried my name in ink so neat it almost looked mechanical, each stroke perfectly weighted. Ms. Evelyn Hart, it read. No return address. Only a faint familiar scent, cedarwood and old paper. My grandfather's scent. I had not heard that name Evelyn Hart said aloud with warmth in years. To my parents, I was usually her, or that girl, or the occasional your sister. When they pretended I was part of a story they still claimed to understand. When I finally broke the seal, the letter crackled like dry leaves. Inside was a single sheet, thick parchment, embossed with my grandfather's estate emblem, a silver crest surrounded by laurel leaves. My eyes scanned the words slowly, the ink glinting under the morning light. To my granddaughter, Evelyn, if this letter reaches you, it means my time has passed. I leave behind not just my estate but my faith in you. Be patient, be wise, and above all, never let guilt disguise itself as love. My breath caught. My grandfather had been a man of few words, but everyone he ever spoke carried weight. When I was young, he used to tell me, "The world will test you through the people who should protect you." At the time, I thought it was just one of his moral lessons, until life proved him right. That day, the phone rang before I could even finish the letter. Evelyn? Darling! It was my mother's voice, honeyed, breathless, and unfamiliar. I hadn't heard her call me darling since I was 12. Hi, Mother. Oh, sweetheart, we just got the news about your grandfather. We're devastated. Her tone cracked in the wrong places. Where grief should have been, I heard calculation. I see, I said. You spoke to him recently? Oh, well, you know how he was. So private. But we always kept in touch. That was a lie. I'd written my grandfather letters every month for the last 5 years. He'd replied to every single one, usually with short notes about his garden, his books, or how proud he was of the life I was building on my own. My parents hadn't visited him once in nearly a decade. By afternoon, another envelope arrived. This one official, crisp, stamped with the seal of his attorney. The words blurred slightly as I read, "The estate of Mr. Harold Whitmore. Last will and testament. Primary beneficiary, Ms. Evelyn Hart." I read the sentence 3 times before it settled in. Everything. He'd left everything to me. The mansion, the vineyard, the accounts, even the old family trust. It didn't seem real. For years, I had lived in a small rented flat, teaching art to children who still believed in stories where families loved each other. I'd learned to survive on simplicity, a small garden, quiet evenings, a cat who didn't demand too much. And now, suddenly, I was the owner of an empire. That evening, as I sat with the letter under a soft pool of lamplight, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice again. The measure of love is not what's given, but what's taken when you're gone. It took less than 24 hours for my parents to show up. They didn't call first. They just arrived. My mother in pearls, my father in his favorite tailored jacket that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and old self-importance. "Sweetheart," my mother said, stepping into my home like she owned the air inside it. "You poor thing. You must be so overwhelmed." My father placed his hand on my shoulder, a gesture so rehearsed it felt foreign. "We're family, Evelyn. We'll handle everything together." I smiled politely, motioning for them to sit. Together? That's new. My mother frowned, pretending not to hear. "I spoke to Mr. Lawrence, the estate attorney. He said we'd need to meet soon. Of course, your grandfather wanted everything divided fairly." "Fairly," I repeated, my tone soft but steady. He actually didn't use that word. He used clearly. He left everything to me. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, my father chuckled, a low, patronizing sound that always made my skin crawl. "Oh, Evelyn," he said, leaning back. "These things are complicated." "You don't understand inheritance law," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with concern that tasted like venom. "It's not about money, darling. It's about legacy. We'll just make sure it's handled properly." "I'm sure you will," I said quietly. "But the will is quite clear." My father's eyes narrowed. "You can't possibly believe Harold would leave everything to you." "We took care of him." That lie hung in the air like smoke. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. My silence had always been louder than their excuses. When they left, my mother kissed my cheek, her perfume cloying and sharp. "We'll be in touch soon," she whispered. "Don't make any big decisions before we talk, okay?" That night, I sat by the window of my small apartment, staring at the city lights flickering like false promises. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't over, and I was right. 3 days later, a thick brown envelope arrived by courier. It wasn't elegant like my grandfather's letter. This one was cold, sterile, official. Notice of legal action. My name appeared on the first line, not as an heir, not as a daughter, but as a defendant. Plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Hart. Allegation, undue influence. Inheritance fraud, emotional manipulation of the deceased. I read the words again, and again, until they blurred. Then I laughed, quietly, bitterly. My parents had decided to sue me for inheriting what they had abandoned. That night, I didn't cry. I made tea, I sat in silence, and I thought of my grandfather's voice again. Never let guilt disguise itself as love. Now, I finally understood what he meant. By the next morning, the phone started ringing. Journalists, relatives, old acquaintances suddenly curious about the family scandal. I ignored them all, but there was one call I couldn't ignore. My grandfather's lawyer. "Evelyn," he said gently, "I think your grandfather left you something else. Not money, a letter. He instructed me to deliver it only if things became difficult." "Difficult?" I repeated. Yes. His exact words were, "When they come for her, give her the truth." I closed my eyes, breathing deeply as the weight of those words settled around me. The truth. Whatever it was, I had the feeling it was far heavier than any fortune. I hung up, my reflection catching in the window. Calm, still, and sharper than I'd ever seen myself before. The next morning, I stood outside the courthouse, watching the marble steps shimmer under the pale sunlight. My mother's voice echoed from across the parking lot, bright and brittle as glass. "There she is," she whispered to my father. Try to look sympathetic. I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. I walked through those doors with the letter in my bag and my grandfather's words in my heart. As I reached the clerk's desk, an officer approached. "Ms. Hart?" he asked, holding a new sealed envelope. "You've been formally summoned." I nodded slowly, my lips curving into the faintest smile. It seemed my parents weren't finished pretending to love me. Not yet. That day, the world didn't turn against me. It just finally showed me who had been standing on the other side all along. I used to believe that pain had a sound, the faint closing of a door that was never open for me. Growing up in the Parker household felt like living in a museum of everything unspoken. My parents, Evelyn and Charles Parker, were admired in our small town. Elegant, respected, always smiling when others looked their way. But behind the polished veneer of family portraits and polite laughter, I was simply an accessory, a quiet child meant to stay in the background. I do not remember the first time they forgot my birthday, only the moment I stopped waiting for them to remember. My mother would be busy hosting tea parties or talking about my sister Claire's piano recitals. My father would shake his head, reading the newspaper, muttering that Amelia should learn to be more like her sister, graceful, sociable, useful. The words became a soundtrack to my childhood. Every compliment they gave to Claire was a reminder of what I was not. Every silence that followed my achievements was its own kind of punishment. When I was 15, I decided to stop asking for their approval. I began to eat dinner alone, studying late in my room while laughter drifted up from the dining hall. Sometimes I'd imagine myself vanishing, wondering if they would even notice. And then, one afternoon I met him, my grandfather, Richard Parker. He lived on the outskirts of town in a sprawling, ivy-covered estate that everyone called the Pines. Until that day, he had been a mystery, spoken about in careful tones as though his name carried a kind of warning. My parents rarely visited him, and when they did, they returned home irritated, whispering about his stubborn ways and his old-fashioned ideals. But when he opened the door that afternoon and looked at me, really looked, I understood why they feared him. He had the kind of presence that could see through people. He didn't speak much at first, but when he did, his voice carried the calm authority of someone who had nothing left to prove. "You look like your grandmother," he said, his gaze softening. She was never afraid to ask questions either. That was the beginning. He taught me things no one else cared to. Not just how to manage accounts or understand contracts, but how to listen without reacting. How to recognize manipulation wrapped in charm. Every visit to his estate felt like stepping into a world that valued truth over image. He would say, "Amelia, strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep standing when no one claps." Those words stayed with me long after he was gone. Years passed, and my parents' distance became predictable, like the ticking of an old clock. Claire married into money, and my parents glowed with pride, introducing her at social events like she was an investment that had finally matured. I was invited to her wedding, but seated at the far end of the table, next to distant cousins and strangers. When I looked at my mother across the room, she smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they think you've accepted your place. But I hadn't. I was learning, quietly. Grandfather's health began to decline 2 years before he passed. My parents rarely visited, saying they were too busy with work, but I went every weekend. I read to him, made tea, listened to his stories about the family business, how he had built everything from scratch, and how greed had a way of rotting even the proudest family tree. One rainy afternoon, as the fire crackled and he struggled to breathe, he took my hand. "Amelia," he said slowly, "I've seen enough to know who deserves to carry this legacy. And it isn't the ones who wear smiles at funerals." He told me he had written something special in his will, a clause, as he called it. He said it was meant to protect not just his money, but his values. "They may come for what's mine," he whispered, "but they'll never truly own what they don't understand." I didn't know what he meant then, but I would soon. After his death, the estate fell silent. The reading of the will was scheduled at a downtown law firm. My parents arrived in black attire, eyes red but not from grief. Claire sat beside them, already rehearsing sympathy for the lawyers. I sat at the back, unsure whether I even belonged in that room. When the lawyer began reading, my mother leaned forward, hands clasped, a faint smile already forming, until he said my name. To my granddaughter, "Amelia Parker, I leave full ownership of the Pines estate and the controlling shares of Parker Holdings." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My father's face flushed a deep red. My mother's eyes went cold, calculating. It wasn't the money that broke them. It was the realization that he had chosen me, the forgotten one. Afterward, they hugged me, their arms stiff like strangers in a staged photograph. "Of course, dear," my mother said. "He loved you too." But behind that brittle tone, I heard the sound of something cracking. For weeks, I lived in quiet disbelief. Every morning, I walked through the halls of my grandfather's house, half expecting him to appear at the top of the stairs, asking if I'd made tea. His study still smelled like cedar and old books. On his desk was a letter, sealed in wax, addressed to me. But when I opened it, it was empty. Or so I thought. Days later, my lawyer called. "Miss Parker," he said carefully, "I think you should come to the office. There's something odd about the documents your parents submitted." That's when I learned that they had filed a claim, a lawsuit demanding equitable redistribution of the inheritance. In simpler terms, they were suing me. That night, I sat in the old library, holding the court summons in my hands. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, calm, unshaken. They may come for what's mine, but they'll never own what they don't understand. I finally understood what he meant. Still, part of me wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe they were just confused, overwhelmed. Maybe, after years of silence, this was their strange way of reaching out. But then I remembered my mother's tone, my father's greedy eyes, the way Claire had whispered, "You'll see, Amelia. You're not the only one who deserves something." The next morning, I received another call from my old friend Jonathan, who had once worked at the same law firm as my parents' attorney. "Amelia," he said quietly, "your parents' lawyer met someone last night. I think they're planning something behind the scenes. You should be careful. Whatever your grandfather left you, it's bigger than money." As I hung up, my gaze drifted toward the old envelope on the desk, the one I thought was empty. Under the flicker of lamplight, I noticed a faint shimmer in the paper, like something had been pressed into it long ago. A code, a message, or maybe a warning. That was the night I decided I wouldn't be their victim anymore. The first time I saw my name on the front page of the local newspaper, it was not for any achievement, not for my work or my grandfather's legacy, but for a lawsuit. "Parker family dispute over $1 million estate," the headline read. Beneath it, a photograph of my parents walking out of the courthouse, heads held high, pretending to be the victims of their daughter's greedy betrayal. It felt surreal. People in town who once nodded politely now whispered when I passed. At the grocery store, a woman I had known since childhood avoided eye contact. At the coffee shop, a young barista smiled awkwardly, sliding the newspaper toward me. "Rough week, huh?" he said. I managed a small nod, pretending it didn't sting. But inside, I felt something shift, the kind of quiet resolve that comes only after being humiliated in public and realizing you have nothing left to lose. The day of the first hearing arrived gray and cold. The courthouse loomed like a monument to everything unspoken in my family. Reporters gathered outside, microphones flashing like knives. I walked past them without a word, the heels of my shoes echoing down the marble hallway. When I stepped into the courtroom, I saw them, my parents, sitting together, perfectly coordinated in grief-colored outfits. My mother wore pearls. My father wore his favorite navy suit, and both of them avoided my gaze. Their lawyer, a man named Harold Crane, turned and smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He leaned toward them and whispered something that made my mother's shoulders shake with amusement. I sat alone at the other table, my hands folded over a single leather folder. Inside it were the documents my grandfather had left me, the will that named me as his heir. But I also had something else, the strange, coded page from the old envelope. As the session began, the judge, a composed woman in her late 50s, adjusted her glasses and said, "Let's proceed." Crane stood first. His voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Your Honor, my clients, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, are seeking equitable redistribution of the late Richard Parker's estate. We believe their daughter, Ms. Amelia Parker, acquired the assets through undue influence and emotional manipulation." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I looked at my mother. She didn't flinch. My lawyer, a quiet man named Thomas Hale, an old friend of my grandfather's, rose calmly. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, "the will was signed and notarized under full capacity. The late Mr. Parker made clear decisions based on documented actions, not emotion. But the damage had already been done." The word manipulation lingered in the air like smoke. When my mother took the stand, her performance began. "Oh, Amelia was always distant," she said softly, tilting her head toward the judge. "She spent so much time with my father. I worried he filled her head with ideas. He could be very persuasive." Her voice trembled perfectly at the right moments, her tears timed to her pauses. The audience sighed in sympathy. My father followed, all stern authority. "My father was a proud man," he declared. "But Amelia, she knew how to get what she wanted. She turned him against his own family. I sat motionless, letting their lies echo against the walls. When my turn came, I stood and looked directly at the judge. "I did not turn anyone against anyone," I said quietly. He reached out to me. He taught me how to think for myself, something I was never allowed to do at home. For a long moment, the judge didn't respond. Then she asked, "Ms. Parker, do you have any written evidence of your grandfather's intent outside the will itself?" I hesitated. My lawyer shot me a cautious look. We hadn't deciphered the code yet. The letter could mean nothing, or everything. "Not yet," I said finally. "But I believe there's something more he left me. Something I haven't fully understood." A faint curiosity flickered in the judge's eyes. "Then I suggest you understand it soon," she said. The hearing continued for hours. My mother's sarcasm grew sharper with every question. My father's arrogance swelled as he discussed family fairness and tradition, and through it all, I felt like I was reliving every year of being dismissed and belittled, but now, under fluorescent lights and legal terms. By the time we recessed for lunch, I was exhausted. I stepped outside to breathe, leaning against the stone column of the courthouse. Reporters swarmed, calling my name. "Ms. Parker, is it true you forged documents? Did your grandfather disinherit your parents out of spite? Are you planning to settle?" I ignored them all. But as I walked down the steps, I noticed a familiar car parked across the street. Jonathan, my old friend, waved me over. "Amelia," he said, his face pale. "I found something. Your parents' lawyer. He's using an old trust loophole. They're claiming your grandfather was mentally unfit when he signed the will." I froze. "That's impossible. He was sharp till the very end." Jonathan shook his head. "They have a signed statement from a doctor who never treated him." I felt my chest tighten. "Fabricated?" He hesitated. "Looks like it, but proving that won't be easy." Inside the courthouse, the afternoon session was worse. Crane introduced the medical statement, and I watched as my mother's eyes glimmered with smug victory. My lawyer objected immediately. "Your Honor, this evidence was not included in discovery. We request an immediate review of its authenticity." The judge frowned. "This document will be examined. Court is adjourned until further notice." I gathered my papers, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the realization that this was no longer about inheritance. It was about truth versus deception. As I left the courtroom, my mother brushed past me, perfume sharp in the air. She leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You can't win this, Amelia," she whispered. "You were never meant to." I turned to face her. "Maybe," I said softly, "but you were never meant to underestimate me either." Outside, the wind picked up, scattering the reporters' papers across the steps. I watched one headline flutter at my feet. "Family feud turns ugly." They were right. It had. But what they didn't know was that beneath the humiliation, a storm was forming, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. That evening, I returned to the Pines. The house felt colder than usual, the air dense with memory. I went to my grandfather's study, the faint smell of cedar still lingering. On his desk, I spread out every document I had, the will, the ledger, the mysterious page from the envelope. Under the glow of the old brass lamp, I noticed something new, faint embossing on the edge of the paper. I tilted it toward the light. Letters appeared, invisible ink brought to life by warmth. It wasn't random. It was a signature, my grandfather's initials, followed by one line in tiny script. "Truth survives the courtroom." I sat back, heart pounding. The message wasn't for lawyers or judges. It was for me. He'd left me a path, not to fight them with rage, but with intelligence. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the windows like the slow ticking of time, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled, not out of joy, but because I could finally feel what my parents never understood. Quiet power, the kind that doesn't shout. The kind that waits for the perfect moment, and that moment was coming. The rain never really stopped that week. It came and went like memory, soft in the morning and relentless by nightfall. The courthouse was quiet for days as the judge reviewed the mysterious medical papers. And while the world waited, I searched. I barely slept. Every corner of my grandfather's study became a map of the past. There were files on his business, old journals, receipts for donations, even birthday cards from me that he had kept in perfect condition. But what mattered most was the sense that he had hidden something. Not to protect his wealth. To protect me. I started with the drawer he never let anyone open. The key had been missing for years. My fingers traced the wood until I felt a faint ridge under the handle. A false panel. I pressed gently. It slid open with a sigh. Inside lay a leather notebook tied with a silk ribbon, its pages yellowed with time. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, the handwriting steady and firm. If you are reading this, Amelia, I am gone. But you are stronger than you think. Money changes people, but truth reveals them. I felt my throat tighten. I kept reading. He wrote about meetings with lawyers, about the clause he called the protection. It stated that if anyone challenged the inheritance through deception or moral fraud, the assets would not go to them nor to me, but to charity. The estate would dissolve completely. It was his test. He knew greed would surface and he wanted it exposed. I turned another page. Tucked inside was a smaller envelope, brittle and sealed with wax. My name was written in his hand. I hesitated, then broke the seal. Inside, a single folded letter and an old photograph. The picture showed him and me in the garden behind the pines. My hand was gripping his arm. I looked about 12. On the back he had written, "The one who stands beside you in truth will never stand against you in court." The letter was longer. "Amelia, if they come for what is not theirs, you will need someone who knows how the system bends. There is a man named Thomas Hale. He was my friend once before he became yours. Trust him. He knows the clause. He knows the proof." I sat back, overwhelmed. Thomas had been my lawyer all along. He must have known parts of this, yet he never told me. Maybe he was waiting for me to find it myself, to earn the strength to face what came next. By morning, I drove through the fog to Thomas's office. He opened the door before I even knocked. "You found it," he said simply. I nodded and handed him the notebook. He spread the pages carefully across his desk. "Your grandfather was smarter than all of them combined," he murmured. "Look here." He pointed to a line of fine print near the end of the will. "If a challenge is made with falsified evidence, the executor has authority to initiate a reversal clause." I frowned. "Reversal?" He smiled faintly. "Meaning the charges turn back on the accusers. In other words, your parents would be the ones on trial for fraud." The room felt suddenly brighter. I exhaled for the first time in days. "But we need proof," he continued. "The forged doctor's statement. If we can show it was filed with intent, the clause activates automatically." "Can we?" He nodded. "We'll need the real doctor's signature to compare. I've already sent an inquiry." That evening, I returned home and listened to the wind moving through the trees. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in that big house. It felt like my grandfather was there, in the silence, guiding every breath. The next morning, a small envelope slid under my door. No address, no sender. Inside were 2 photographs, one of my parents' lawyers shaking hands with a man outside a clinic, and another of them exchanging an envelope. Underneath, a note. "He never treated your grandfather. He only sold the signature, no name." No clue who sent it. But it was enough. At the next hearing, I sat straighter than before. My parents looked confident, radiant even. They thought the forged statement had cornered me, the judge began. "We have reviewed new materials submitted by both parties. Mr. Hale, you may proceed." Thomas stood, his voice steady. "Your Honor, we have obtained verification from Dr. Leon Merritt, the physician listed on Exhibit B. He confirms he has never treated or met the late Richard Parker." Gasps filled the courtroom. My mother's hand froze on her necklace. My father's jaw tightened. Thomas placed the photographs on the evidence table. "Additionally, we have visual proof of an exchange between Mr. Crane and an unidentified individual at the same clinic. We believe this was a purchase of falsified documentation, Crane objected loudly, but the judge silenced him. I will review this immediately. As the bailiff gathered the photos, I glanced at my parents. My mother avoided my eyes. My father leaned back, smirking, as if still untouchable. Then the judge turned to me. Ms. Parker, your grandfather's will contains an unusual clause, referenced by your counsel. Do you have supporting material to confirm its authenticity? I stood and handed her the notebook. He wrote this in his own hand. It includes the clause, the signature, and a notarized reference. The judge read silently, her expression shifting slowly from neutrality to intrigue. Then she looked up. This changes everything. The court will verify these entries, but if confirmed, the original plaintiffs may face charges of fraudulent filing. The silence was thunderous. My mother's face drained of color. My father leaned forward sharply. You can't do this, she's twisting his words. The judge's tone was calm but final. Mr. Parker, I advise you to remain silent. Any further manipulation will count against you. We recessed again. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but their words blurred into background noise. I walked down the courthouse steps feeling lighter than I had in years. It wasn't victory yet, but it was truth beginning to breathe. That night, I stood by the window of my grandfather's study, notebook still open on the desk. The rain had stopped. The moonlight rested on the old brass lamp. I whispered, You planned this, didn't you? In the stillness, I almost heard his laugh, the warm, deep one that used to echo across the garden. For the first time since his death, I allowed myself to cry. Not for the loss, but for the love that had survived betrayal, greed, and time. Downstairs, the clock chimed midnight. Tomorrow, the final phase would begin, the one my parents could never anticipate, because this fight was never about inheritance. It was about truth finally being seen, and I was ready to let the light in. The morning of the final hearing felt heavier than any before. Even the air in the courthouse seemed charged, a storm that hadn't yet broken. The corridors were crowded, journalists whispering, cameras waiting like vultures outside. But I walked through it all in silence. I had learned that silence unsettled people more than anger ever could. Thomas walked beside me, his briefcase clutched tightly. They're cornered, he said quietly. Expect a show. He was right. When the courtroom doors opened, my parents were already seated. My mother wore a pearl gray dress, the same one she had worn to my high school graduation. I remembered how she had smiled for the photos that day, pretending we were a family. My father sat stiffly beside her, eyes sharp, lips tight, every bit the man who'd always believed control was his birthright. As I took my seat, my mother turned toward me. You're really going through with this? She whispered, voice dripping with disbelief. Dragging us through mud, your own family? I looked straight ahead. Family doesn't drag you first, the judge entered. The chatter died instantly. We rose. Then came the moment of stillness, that eerie quiet before the storm. Thomas began our presentation, laying out the evidence carefully. The forged medical document, the photograph, the clause that turned every false accusation back upon the accuser. The judge listened intently, her fingers steepled under her chin. Every few minutes she asked sharp, precise questions, the kind that left no room for lies. Then it was their turn. Their lawyer, Mr. Crane, stood with theatrical confidence. Your Honor, he said, this entire case is an emotional spectacle. My clients, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, are grieving parents who've been manipulated by their daughter's greed. She's twisting her grandfather's memory for her gain. I felt my heart tighten, not from his words, but from how easily they came. Then he turned to me directly. Ms. Parker, tell us, did you not feel neglected as a child? Did you not resent your parents for the attention your grandfather gave you? Thomas objected immediately, but the judge allowed it. You may answer briefly, I stood. Resentment is born when love is uneven, I said softly. But neglect teaches clarity, and clarity is what brought me here, Crane smirked. So you admit your motivations are emotional? No, I replied. They're factual. You forged documents. You built your case on lies. My grandfather's love was never conditional. But yours was, always. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father's hands clenched on the table. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated. Crane stepped aside and called a surprise witness. The doors opened, and there she was, Lydia, my childhood friend. The one person I had trusted enough to confide in when my parents first filed the lawsuit. I froze. "Ms. Wallace," Crane said smoothly, "you claim to have seen Ms. Parker manipulating documents in her grandfather's study after his death. Is that correct?" Lydia looked down. Her voice trembled. "Yes, I saw her remove something from his desk. Papers." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. I stared at her. Disbelief, then realization. She had visited me the night after the funeral. I had left her alone in the study for a few minutes while I made tea. I remembered her asking innocent questions about the will. I never thought she was being used. Thomas leaned closer to me. "We can discredit this easily," he whispered, but I couldn't hear him. The room had blurred into noise. Betrayal doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in silence, with familiar eyes and a shaking voice. Crane pushed forward, sensing weakness. "See, Your Honor?" The defendant tampered with the will before the official reading. "This entire case is built on deception," Thomas objected, furious. "That's a fabrication." "No proof." The judge struck her gavel. "Enough. I'll review this new testimony." Lydia avoided my gaze as she stepped down. I saw guilt flicker across her face, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. For the first time, I felt my composure slipping. The room felt smaller, airless. My parents' lawyer smirked, my mother looked away, and my father smiled. A small, cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who thought he had finally won. We recessed for lunch. Outside, rain had started again. Soft, almost mocking. I stood under the overhang, staring at the courthouse gardens, their flowers drowning quietly. Thomas joined me, his tone gentle. "She's lying for them. They must have promised her something," I nodded. "Money or forgiveness?" He looked at me carefully. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" "There's still time to settle," I turned to him. "Settle? You think this is about money?" "They've already taken everything worth forgiving." He said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, back home, I found another letter. It was slipped under the front door, like the last one. This one had only one sentence. "Trust the clause. The truth can't be buried twice. No signature." But I recognized the handwriting. Lydia's. She had lied under oath, but now she was confessing. The next morning, I returned to court with the note sealed in my coat pocket. The tension inside was thicker than before. Everyone could sense the verdict was near. When the judge entered, her eyes moved between both tables, calm, unreadable. "Before we proceed," she said, "I have reviewed the testimony and documents submitted yesterday. There are serious concerns regarding witness integrity and document authenticity." Crane stiffened. "Your Honor," she raised her hand. "Be silent, Mr. Crane. Ms. Parker, do you have anything further before I make my ruling?" I rose slowly, my voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I have one final submission, a written statement from Ms. Wallace delivered last night." Crane protested, shouting that it was inadmissible, but the judge took it, reading quickly. Then she looked at him with an expression I'll never forget. Pure disappointment. "This testimony," she said quietly, "was coerced. Your witness was offered payment from the plaintiff's representative." My mother gasped audibly. My father's head snapped toward her, eyes wide with fury. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel thundered. "Enough. This court will not tolerate manipulation of any kind. Given the evidence, and in accordance with the reversal clause," she paused, letting the silence settle like dust. "This case is hereby dismissed. Charges will be reassigned to the plaintiffs for fraudulent filing." The words hung in the air like a final bell. I didn't smile. I didn't even breathe. I just felt the weight of years lift from my chest. Quiet, steady, complete. My mother's pearls broke as she clutched her throat. My father slammed his hands on the table, shouting, but the sound didn't touch me. I gathered my papers and walked out. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart. Sunlight touched the courthouse steps, thin and warm. I stood there for a long moment, eyes closed, feeling it on my face. That was the day I understood what my grandfather meant when he wrote, "Money changes people, but truth reveals them." He was right. They had tried to humiliate me in front of the world, but all they did was show who they really were, and I had never been prouder to carry his name. The next morning, the world seemed unnaturally still. No birdsong, no movement outside my window, just that fragile kind of silence that comes before something irreversible. I arrived at the courthouse early. The marble steps were still slick from the night's rain, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. I paused there for a moment, breathing, steadying. The world had taken so much from me already. Today, it would give something back. Truth. Inside, the courtroom was dim, the air heavy with perfume and paper and tension. Reporters had filled the back rows this time. My parents entered soon after. No words between them, only mutual blame flickering behind their eyes. My mother wouldn't look at me. My father did, just once, and it was with the hollow stare of a man who'd gambled everything and already sensed he'd lost. Thomas leaned toward me. "Stay calm," he whispered. "The judge has everything she needs." The gavel struck. "All rise." Judge Whitfield looked composed. But there was a current in her tone I hadn't heard before. Something deliberate, almost restrained. "This court has spent several weeks reviewing the evidence surrounding Parker versus Parker," she began. "And after extensive examination, it appears that this case was built upon deception from its very foundation," the gallery murmured. My mother's hand twitched. My father's jaw locked. The judge continued, reading from her notes. "The will of the late Mr. Arthur Whitmore contained a clause that specifically prohibits financial claims from any relative who engages in fraudulent or coercive action against another heir." Her gaze lifted, resting on my parents. "That clause is binding and self-enforcing. Therefore, any party proven to have acted with malice forfeits their inheritance rights entirely." My heart pounded. My grandfather's words echoed in my memory. The real inheritance isn't money, it's power. Crane, their lawyer, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this clause was never presented in the official record." "It's hearsay. It was hidden," Thomas interrupted calmly, "and authenticated by the estate's secondary counsel." He stepped forward holding a sealed folder. "With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to present the original amendment, signed by Mr. Whitmore and witnessed by 2 legal representatives." The judge nodded. Thomas handed her the folder. The paper rustled softly as she read, lips tightening slightly as she reached the final paragraph. Then she looked up. "Mr. Crane," she said coolly, "would you like to explain why your clients submitted falsified copies of the same document?" The color drained from Crane's face. I had no knowledge." "Enough," the judge said sharply. "Perjury is a serious offense." My parents exchanged quick, panicked looks. My mother gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. My father started to speak, but his voice cracked. "We didn't know, we thought—" Judge Whitfield raised a hand. "Please. I will read this for the record." She turned to the court clerk, her voice clear and measured. "In the event that my granddaughter, Miss Parker, is subjected to false claims by any family member, such parties shall relinquish all inheritance rights, and any pending claims shall be reversed against them." Gasps filled the room. Cameras clicked from the back row. My mother's face went pale. The judge lowered the paper. "This clause activates automatically upon verification of deceit, which means—" She paused, looked directly at my parents. "The charges are now against you." The silence that followed was so complete it almost hummed. My mother blinked, confusion flickering across her face as if the words couldn't reach her. My father's mouth fell open. What are you saying?" The judge's tone was firm, but not cruel. "I'm saying, Mr. and Mrs. Parker, that this case you filed has legally turned against you. You are now under investigation for fraud, coercion, and defamation." My breath caught. Even knowing the truth, hearing it aloud felt unreal. Thomas exhaled quietly beside me. My mother finally found her voice. "We are her parents. We did what we thought was right. The judge looked at her, not with anger, but pity. No, Mrs. Parker. You did what was convenient. And in doing so, you violated both trust and law. My mother broke then, the poise slipping, the tears falling. We just wanted what we deserved. And you got it, I said softly. Just not the way you expected. Her eyes snapped to mine, red and glassy. You think this makes you happy? Watching your own mother fall? I shook my head. No, Mother. It just means I finally stood. The judge called order again as the room descended into whispers. Reporters scribbled notes. Flashbulbs flickered. My father slumped back in his chair, muttering under his breath about inheritance, loyalty, and betrayal. When the gavel struck for recess, it sounded final, like the closing of a door that had been left open for too long. Outside, the sunlight was blinding. For the first time in months, I breathed deeply, not the shallow breaths of survival, but the slow, grounding ones of freedom. Thomas joined me on the courthouse steps. You did it, he said quietly. I smiled faintly. No, Thomas. He did, he frowned. Your grandfather? I nodded. He saw them for who they were long before I could. He didn't leave me money. He left me a way out. Thomas placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. What will you do now? I looked out toward the distant skyline, glass buildings glinting in the light. Something they'll never understand, I said softly. Live without needing to prove I deserve to. Behind us, the courthouse doors opened again. Reporters shouted my name, microphones extended like spears. Ms. Parker, will you forgive your parents? Will you press charges? Are you keeping the inheritance? I turned only once. Forgiveness isn't a transaction, I said. It's a release. And I'm already free. I walked away then, not toward the cameras, but toward the sunlight at the edge of the plaza. That was the real victory. Not the money, not the name. The peace that came from standing tall after being bent for too long. My grandfather had once told me, you can't teach grace. You earn it when the world gives you every reason to lose it. He was right. And that day, I finally felt what he meant. The courthouse looked different the next morning. It was brighter, not because of the weather, but because I finally saw it for what it was. Not a battlefield, but a stage for truth. The air was crisp when I arrived. The marble echoed with every step I took, steady, deliberate, unhurried. I'd spent my entire life rushing to prove myself. Today, I walked slowly, because for once I owed no one an explanation. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with hushed tension. Reporters had doubled overnight. My parents sat together at the defense table now, their eyes fixed forward, their pride shattered but their defiance intact. They looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of consequence had begun to settle on their shoulders. Thomas stood beside me, files in order, calm as ever. He had been my quiet anchor through every storm. Judge Whitfield entered, robes flowing like a dark tide. This session will continue where it left off, she said firmly. The evidence presented yesterday has been verified in full. My mother's breath hitched. My father's hand clenched into a fist. Thomas rose. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to present one final exhibit. The financial records discovered last night. The judge gestured for him to proceed. He handed her a thick folder. The sound of its clasp snapping open filled the room like thunder. These, he continued, are bank statements showing a transfer of $250,000 from Mr. and Mrs. Parker to their legal representative, 1 week before the filing of this case. The same day the falsified will documents were notarized, the courtroom rippled with murmurs. The judge's brow furrowed as she turned each page. My mother began to whisper frantically to her husband. He ignored her. His jaw was tight, his eyes glassy. Thomas stepped back. Your Honor, this transfer was not part of any legitimate legal fee. It was a bribe. Silence fell. Judge Whitfield looked up, her expression grave. Is this true, Mr. Crane? The lawyer, pale and trembling, wiped his forehead. I was instructed. That's enough, the judge interrupted. Mr. and Mrs. Parker, please stand. They did, reluctantly. You attempted to defraud this court, falsify legal documents, And manipulate an heir out of her rightful inheritance, she said slowly, each word deliberate. The law will now hold you accountable. My father tried to protest, but his voice cracked. We were only trying to protect what was ours. What was yours? The judge's tone sharpened. Mr. Whitmore's estate was his to give, and he gave it to your daughter because she earned it. Because she stood for values you abandoned. My mother started crying. Soft at first, then uncontrollable sobs that filled the room. For the first time in my life, those tears didn't move me. Judge Whitfield signed the final order. All charges against Ms. Parker are hereby dismissed. The estate of Arthur Whitmore is to remain solely in her possession. Furthermore, this court will open an investigation into fraudulent activity on the part of Mr. and Mrs. Parker. The gavel struck once. Final. Irrevocable. Reporters surged forward. Flashbulbs burst. Voices rose, a storm of questions, disbelief, excitement. But I barely heard any of it. I looked at my parents, their faces drained, their postures collapsing under the truth they'd spent their lives avoiding. My father's voice trembled. We're still your parents, I nodded slowly. Yes, and that's exactly why this hurts as much as it frees me. My mother looked up at me, eyes red, lips trembling. You think you've won? I met her gaze. No, Mother. I think I've finally stopped losing myself. I turned away. The flash of cameras followed, but for once, I wasn't afraid of the light. Outside, the air was cool. Thomas walked beside me silently. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a soft echo, the sound of closure. She'd be proud of you, he said after a moment. I smiled faintly. He would be, I corrected gently. Grandfather saw this coming long before I did. Thomas nodded. And what will you do now? I looked toward the skyline, glass towers shining like quiet sentinels. I think I'll build something that lasts longer than money, I said. Maybe a foundation, scholarships for girls who were told to be quiet, to settle, to shrink. He smiled. Using the inheritance to give others a voice? Yes, I whispered. That's what he wanted all along, for me to turn pain into purpose. We walked toward the car, the sound of traffic humming softly in the background. Life had resumed its rhythm, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. A reporter called out behind me, Ms. Parker! Any final statement? I paused at the curb, turned slightly, and spoke loud enough for them to hear. Justice isn't loud, I said. It's steady. It doesn't humiliate. It restores. Then I got in the car and closed the door. As we drove away, I glanced out the window. My reflection looked older, stronger, and free. The city passed by in streaks of light, each one brighter than the last. That night, I stood on my balcony, the estate papers in my hand. The moon hung low, soft and golden, as if blessing the quiet. I thought of my grandfather again, his steady voice, his unwavering eyes. You'll understand someday, he had told me once. And I finally did. Justice wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. It was the moment you looked at those who wronged you and no longer needed them to change. The wind rustled the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. I whispered into the night. Thank you, Grandfather. For everything, even the lessons I never wanted to learn. And as the bells faded, peace settled, deep and certain. For the first time in my life, I felt whole. No courtroom could give that. No verdict could take it away. The wind at the countryside estate was softer than I remembered. It carried the faint scent of rain and cedar, the kind of smell that used to mean home, before that word became complicated. It had been 6 months since the trial ended. The newspapers had moved on, the city had found new stories to feed on, and I had quietly disappeared from their noise. I'd moved out of the family mansion and bought a small cottage on the edge of the Whitmore property, still close enough to remember, but far enough to finally breathe. Every morning, I walked the same trail my grandfather once took, the one that curved around the lake and led to the small stone garden where he used to sit and write. That was where I came today, a white lily in my hand and the sound of peace in my chest. His headstone was simple, carved in gray marble with his favorite quote etched beneath. "Strength is not about power. It's about peace that cannot be stolen." For a long moment, I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me. The birds sang in the distance, and the wind moved through the trees like a whisper from another life. "I did it, grandfather," I finally said softly, but not the way they expected. "I didn't fight to destroy them. I fought to remember you." My voice trembled slightly, not from pain, but from gratitude. There was something sacred about surviving, not in defiance, but in grace. I knelt down and placed the lily at the base of the stone. "You warned me that love without respect becomes ownership. I didn't understand it then, but now, I see it in everything they did." The wind rustled through the leaves, as if agreeing. I closed my eyes and remembered the girl I used to be, the one who waited by the door for a mother who never showed, who spent birthdays in silence, who mistook neglect for patience. She had carried the weight of wanting to be seen for so long that it had almost broken her. But now, I understood something deeper. Sometimes the people who refuse to love you are the ones who teach you how to love yourself. I sat down on the cool stone bench beside the grave. "Do you know what I did with it, grandfather? The inheritance?" I smiled faintly. "I turned it into something living. I created a foundation. Scholarships for girls who were told they weren't enough, grants for women starting again after losing everything. I called it the Whitmore Trust." A tear slid down my cheek, not from sorrow, but pride. It felt right. Your name helping others rebuild, not just survive. "I think you'd like that." The sunlight broke through the clouds just then, spilling gold over the grass. The lake shimmered in reflection, and for a moment I could almost hear his laughter. Deep, calm, proud. "I thought revenge would feel louder," I whispered. "But it doesn't. It feels quiet like this. It feels like breathing after years of holding it in." I stood slowly, brushing the dust from my hands, and looked toward the horizon. Beyond the trees, I could see the city skyline faintly, the place where everything had fallen apart, and yet, somehow, also where everything had begun. That night, I returned home to my cottage. It was small but warm, the walls covered with soft light and framed photographs, not of family, but of people from the foundation, the lives touched by her grandfather's legacy. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the rain begin again. It wasn't the heavy, lonely kind anymore. It was gentle, cleansing, like forgiveness. My phone buzzed. It was Thomas. "They approved the new mentorship program," his text read. I smiled and replied, "Then we're just getting started." The kettle whistled, and I poured myself a cup, the steam curling like memory. As I sipped, my reflection in the window seemed to merge with the night outside, calm, resolute, at peace. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from a nearby village, and for a moment, I let myself imagine my grandfather sitting beside me, nodding in approval. "Peace suits you," he'd probably say, and he'd be right. I had learned something precious through all of it, that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the final act of strength. It's what lets you close a door gently instead of slamming it shut. Before bed, I opened the drawer of my desk and pulled out the last letter my grandfather had ever written me, the one I hadn't been able to read during the chaos. The paper had yellowed slightly, but his handwriting was still elegant, deliberate. "My dearest Amelia, if you are reading this, it means life has tested you in ways I hoped it never would. But remember this, we do not heal by proving them wrong. We heal by proving ourselves right. The world will not always be kind, but it will always mirror your truth. Live it bravely." I folded the letter gently and pressed it to my chest. "Thank you," I whispered, "for loving me enough to let me learn." When I finally turned off the lamp, the rain had stopped. The air smelled of earth and lavender. I slipped under the blanket and closed my eyes, my heart still full of the words he'd left me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't dream of justice. I dreamed of peace. The next morning, the sky was pink with dawn. I walked outside barefoot, the grass cool under my feet, the world silent except for the distant hum of waking birds. A delivery truck was parked by the gate. The driver smiled and handed me a small wooden box. No return address, just my name engraved in careful script. Inside was a brass plaque. It read, "In memory of Arthur Whitmore, and in honor of those who rise with grace." My eyes stung. I carried it to the garden and placed it beside a blooming white rose bush. The sunlight caught the metal, making it glow like gold. It felt like an ending and a beginning. As I stood there, a thought crossed my mind. The same one that had followed me since the trial. That pain doesn't disappear when you win. It transforms when you choose to understand it. I looked toward the hills, the breeze tugging at my hair. "I'm home now," I whispered, "in every way that matters." And for a moment, it felt as though the entire world exhaled with me. If Amelia's story moved you, share it with someone who's ever had to stand alone to be seen. Because sometimes justice isn't about punishment, it's about peace and the quiet glow that comes after the storm.